The world has never been louder than it is right now. And the people losing the most are often the ones trying hardest to be heard above the noise. Every platform rewarding the loudest voice. Every algorithm favoring the most frequent poster. Every cultural message saying that visibility equals value and that the person winning is the person most seen. And so most people spend their energy trying to be heard, constantly producing, constantly announcing, constantly performing the appearance of progress for whoever happens to be watching. And they wonder why, despite all that noise, despite all that visible activity and all that effort to stay present in the conversation, something still feels hollow. Something still feels like the real thing keeps not arriving. Carl Jung understood something about this that most modern success culture completely ignores. He said the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not who the noise told you to be, not who the performance required you to appear to be, not the version of yourself assembled from other people's expectations and the algorithm's preferences and the crowd's definition of what winning looks like. Who you actually are beneath all of it. And becoming that person, the genuine one, requires something most people are genuinely afraid to practice. Genuine silence. The deliberate withdrawal from external noise long enough to discover what is actually driving the internal life. Long enough to examine the patterns that have been running beneath the surface of every decision and every reaction. Long enough to hear the genuine signal beneath the noise. The Stoics called this inner examination, and they understood that without it, everything built on the outside is constructed on an unstable foundation. Seneca wrote, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it. And one of the primary ways people waste it is by staying loud about things that do not matter, while never going quiet enough to understand what does." This conversation is about the strategy that most successful people practiced and almost nobody openly teaches. Go silent, not permanently, not as retreat from the world, as the deliberate and strategic practice of turning inward before going outward, of understanding before acting, of building depth before expecting height. 10 lessons, the psychology and the philosophy of why going silent is the hidden strategy of real success. Before we begin, type this in the comments and mean it. I go silent, I go deep, I win real. Lesson 1. The noise is not the path. It is the obstacle disguised as the path. Here is something worth examining honestly. Most of what passes for productivity in the modern world is not productive. It is busy. And busy and productive are not the same thing. Busy is movement without meaningful direction. Productive is movement that builds something real toward a destination that was consciously chosen. And the difference between them is almost invisible from the outside, but enormous from the inside when the honest accounting happens. Jung called this phenomenon living in the persona. The persona being the mask constructed for the world. The professional version, the capable version, the always moving forward version. And the persona can become so convincing, so thoroughly maintained, that the person wearing it genuinely loses track of the difference between the performance and the reality, between what they are appearing to build and what they are actually building. Here is something psychologically important about the modern noise environment that most people have never considered. The brain processes social approval and social threat through the same neural pathways that process physical safety and physical danger. This means that every notification, every like, every comment, every piece of social feedback activates the same survival systems that were designed for genuinely life or death situations. The brain treats social visibility as a survival necessity. And this is why going silent feels genuinely threatening to most people, not because it is actually dangerous, because the brain has been trained by a constant stream of social feedback to treat the absence of that feedback as an alarm signal, as evidence that something is wrong, as the social equivalent of being left behind by the tribe. And that alarm keeps most people permanently in the noise, permanently feeding the system, permanently producing content and seeking validation and staying visible because the alternative feels psychologically threatening even when it is strategically superior. The Stoics understood this dynamic without the neuroscience to explain it. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Do not indulge in dreams of having what you have not, but reckon up the chief of the blessings you do possess." The honest assessment of what you actually have, rather than the performance of what you want others to believe you have. And that honest assessment requires something the noise actively prevents: stillness. The quiet in which the difference between the appearance and the reality becomes visible. Because in the noise the appearance and the reality blur together. In the quiet they separate clearly. And the person who can see that separation clearly is the person who can actually address it, who can stop building the impression and start building the thing. Lesson 2. Jung's individuation. The process nobody teaches and everybody needs. Carl Jung spent decades developing a concept he called individuation. It is one of the most important and least understood ideas in the history of psychology. Individuation is the process of becoming fully and genuinely yourself, not the version of yourself assembled from other people's expectations, not the version constructed to fit the role your environment assigned you, the actual you. But here is what most people misunderstand about individuation. It is not a destination you arrive at. It is an ongoing process of differentiation, of separating what is genuinely yours from what was given to you by the culture, the family, the education system, the peer group, the algorithm. Jung observed that most people begin life by absorbing the values and the beliefs and the behavioral patterns of their environment without any conscious examination of whether those values and beliefs and patterns are genuinely theirs. They inherit a self rather than developing one, and the inherited self, however functional it may be in the environments that produced it, is not the genuine self. It is an adaptation, and adaptations, however useful, carry hidden costs. The primary cost being the chronic sense of misalignment that most people feel when they are honest about it. The feeling that the life they are living is not quite the life that belongs to them, that something about the direction is slightly off in a way they cannot fully name. That feeling is not neurosis, it is not ingratitude, it is the signal of the genuine self indicating that the adaptation has been prioritized over the authentic expression for long enough that the gap has become noticeable. Epictetus said, "Know first who you are and then adorn yourself accordingly." Know first who you are, not who the performance requires you to appear to be, who you actually are. And that knowing requires a specific kind of examination that can only happen in silence. The examination of which values feel genuinely yours when you hold them away from social context. Which directions feel genuinely alive when you imagine pursuing them with no audience watching. Which ways of engaging with the world feel like genuine expression rather than strategic performance. Those questions cannot be honestly answered in the noise. Because in the noise, the social context is always present. The imagined audience is always available to shape the answer toward what will be approved, rather than toward what is actually true. Only in genuine silence do the honest answers become available. Lesson 3. The shadow. What you have never examined is quietly running everything. Jung developed another concept that is even more directly relevant to why intelligent, capable people consistently fail to achieve what they are genuinely capable of. He called it the shadow. The shadow is not something dark or sinister. It is simply the collection of everything about yourself that has never been brought into conscious awareness. The patterns you repeat without understanding why. The reactions that feel disproportionate to the situation that triggered them. The behaviors that undermine your own genuine intentions. The fears that masquerade as practical concerns. But here is the psychological mechanism that makes the shadow so influential. Jung discovered that the content of the shadow does not disappear simply because it is unacknowledged. It operates through a process he called projection. When we encounter something in another person that belongs to our own unexamined shadow material, we experience it as an intensely negative quality in that person, rather than recognizing it as something we have not yet integrated in ourselves. The person who has never examined their own ambition judges others as excessively ambitious. The person who has never acknowledged their own fear presents themselves as fearless, while consistently avoiding situations that might expose it. The person who has never examined their need for control experiences themselves as spontaneous, while unconsciously engineering outcomes to fit their unacknowledged preferences. All of this happens automatically, below the level of conscious awareness, directing behavior, shaping relationships, producing outcomes. And the person who has never gone silent long enough to examine it is being directed by it entirely, while genuinely believing they are directing themselves. The Stoics understood a version of this deeply. Seneca wrote, "Most powerful is he who has himself in his own power." Having yourself in your own power requires knowing what is actually operating inside you, requires the honest examination of the patterns and the fears and the projections that have been directing the show from beneath the surface. And that examination only happens in the silence, where the noise cannot drown out the signal. The practical implication of this for success and achievement is direct. Every time you find yourself repeatedly stuck in the same kind of situation, the shadow is at work. Every time a specific kind of person consistently triggers a disproportionate reaction in you, the shadow is projecting. Every time your behavior contradicts your stated intentions in a consistent pattern, the shadow is running the show. And the only way to change those outcomes is to go silent long enough to examine what is generating them. Not to fix it dramatically, to simply see it clearly. Because Jung consistently found that what is seen clearly loses a significant portion of its automatic power. The shadow does not control what is genuinely conscious. It only controls what remains in the dark. Lesson 4. Stoic withdrawal, the ancient practice of strategic silence. The Stoics practiced something they called the retreat into oneself. Not the retreat of avoidance or the silence of giving up, the deliberate and strategic withdrawal from external noise into internal examination. They understood that the external world would always be demanding, always generating new situations requiring response, always presenting new provocations and new distractions and new opportunities to disperse energy in directions that led nowhere significant. And they understood that operating effectively in that external world required something the external world would never provide on its own. An internal foundation solid enough to stand on regardless of what the external world produced. What is particularly important to understand about the Stoic practice of withdrawal is that it was not occasional. It was daily, deliberate, built into the structure of the life as a non-negotiable practice rather than as something that happened when circumstances allowed. Marcus Aurelius, governing the most powerful empire in the known world, wrote his meditations in the quiet between battles, not for publication, not for posterity, as private notes to himself, a daily practice of retreating into honest self-examination before the demands of the day could pull him entirely outward. Epictetus taught his students a specific daily practice he called the evening review. Each evening they were to sit in silence and examine the day honestly. Where had they acted in alignment with their values and where had they not? Where had the automatic reactions run unchecked and where had they exercised genuine choice? Where had they moved toward their genuine goals and where had they been pulled by distraction or reactive impulse? This examination was not about guilt or self-criticism. It was about accurate information, about building a genuinely honest picture of how the life was actually being lived rather than how it appeared from the performing of it. And that accurate information, gathered daily in genuine silence, was the foundation from which genuine improvement became possible. Because you cannot improve what you have not honestly examined, and you cannot honestly examine what you never go quiet enough to see. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. Power over your mind." Built and maintained in the daily practice of going silent long enough to examine what the mind was actually doing. Lesson 5. What silence actually does. The neuroscience and psychology of stillness. Most people think of silence as the absence of something, the absence of noise, the absence of activity. But silence is not the absence of something. It is the presence of something that the noise was preventing. When the external noise stops, the internal processing begins in a qualitatively different mode. Neuroscientists call this the default mode network, the brain system that activates during periods of quiet and inward focus. This network is responsible for some of the most sophisticated cognitive functions available to the human brain. Self-referential thinking, the ability to understand other people's perspectives, the integration of past experience with present understanding, the generation of creative insight. And here is what is critically important about the default mode network. It is suppressed by external stimulation. Every time the brain is processing incoming information from the external environment, the default mode network reduces its activity, which means that every moment spent in reaction to external stimulation is a moment during which the most sophisticated internal processing the brain is capable of is being suppressed. The person who is constantly in reaction mode, constantly processing incoming information from platforms and notifications and conversations and content, is chronically suppressing the very neural systems responsible for the deepest self-understanding and the most sophisticated thinking. And the person who practices genuine silence regularly is giving those systems the space they need to do what they were designed to do. Jung called this the transcendent function, the capacity of the psyche to produce genuine insight and genuine synthesis when given the space that constant stimulation prevents. The insights produced in this mode are qualitatively different from thoughts produced in reaction mode. They are deeper, more connected to the actual situation, more genuinely aligned with what is true rather than what is simply the next available response. Epictetus wrote, "It is impossible for a man to learn what he thinks he already knows." The mind in constant reaction mode thinks it already knows. The mind in genuine silence discovers what it does not yet know. And that discovering is what produces the quality shift in outcomes that people describe when they talk about going silent and coming back with something genuinely different. Lesson 6. The danger of constant performance. Why showing everything builds nothing. There is a specific and under-examined psychological cost to the culture of constant sharing. The culture that says document everything, share every step, perform every stage of the process for an audience. Jung identified a dynamic in clinical work that is directly relevant here. He called it the premature crystallization of the psyche. When a developing insight or a growing capacity is shared publicly too early before it has been fully formed and integrated, something happens to it that prevents it from developing further. The insight crystallizes in its premature form. It becomes fixed in the version that was shareable rather than continuing to develop toward the version that was genuinely true, because the sharing introduces a social dimension. The developing thought is now being shaped not only by the internal process of genuine examination, but also by the external process of social reception, by how it was received, by what response it generated, by whether it produced approval or criticism, and those social signals, however subtle, begin to shape the ongoing development of the insight in ways that serve the social reception rather than the genuine truth. The result is a thought that looks fully formed from the outside and is actually incomplete from the inside. A position that has been hardened before it was ready to be hardened. A self-understanding that has been shared before it was fully understood. Psychologically, this produces a specific kind of stagnation. The person who shares too early, who performs the process rather than doing it, stops developing at the level of the sharing. They produce more of the same rather than genuinely deeper understanding, because the social feedback loop has replaced the internal examination loop. The Stoics were deeply suspicious of the impulse to share every step. Seneca wrote, "Retire into yourself as much as possible. Go silent. Do the actual work. Let the results speak when they are ready, not before." Lesson 7. The Persona and the True Self. Jung's most practical lesson for achievement. Jung spent enormous clinical attention on what he called the persona. The word comes from the Latin for mask, the face we present to the world. And here is something specific about the persona that most people never examine. The persona is not constructed deliberately. It is constructed in response to the environment. It is the shape the self takes in order to survive and function in the specific social context it finds itself in. The child who learns that emotional expression produces withdrawal from caregivers develops a persona of emotional containment. The student who learns that intellectual performance produces approval develops a persona of competence and capability. The professional who learns that confidence produces opportunities develops a persona of certainty, even in situations where genuine uncertainty would be more accurate. All of these are adaptations, genuinely useful in the contexts that produced them, and genuinely costly in the ways that adaptations always are, because every adaptation involves a trade-off. The persona gains social function by suppressing aspects of the genuine self that the social context does not reward. And those suppressed aspects do not disappear. They go into the shadow. They become the unexamined material running beneath the surface. They become the gap between the performing life and the genuinely lived one. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Never esteem anything as of advantage to you that will make you break your word or lose your self-respect." The person who has exchanged their genuine self for a persona that serves external approval has, in the deepest sense, lost the self-respect that comes from genuine alignment between who you are and how you live. And recovering that alignment requires going silent long enough to distinguish between the persona and the genuine self. To ask honestly, which of my values are genuinely mine and which did I absorb from the environment to survive in it? Which of my directions are genuinely mine and which am I pursuing because the persona I developed requires them? Which of my ways of engaging with the world are genuine expression and which are strategic adaptation that has been running so long it feels like personality? Those questions require silence to be answered honestly, and their honest answers are the foundation from which genuine success becomes possible. Lesson 8. Strategic silence in practice. The specific methods that actually work. Most people, when they hear the idea of going silent, imagine something impractical. A month-long retreat, a complete withdrawal from all social engagement. That is not what the genuine practice looks like. Strategic silence, as both Jung and the Stoics practiced and taught it, is practical and immediately available within the ordinary structure of daily life. Here are the specific methods that work. The first is what Jung called active imagination, not passive daydreaming. The deliberate practice of sitting in genuine quiet and giving full attention to whatever internal material surfaces, images, thoughts, feelings, the half-formed ideas that the noise of the day prevents from developing. Active imagination treats this material seriously. It gives it space to develop rather than immediately assessing it for social shareability. And what emerges from this practice, done consistently, is a quality of self-understanding that no amount of external activity can produce. The second is the Stoic practice of the morning preparation, before the day begins, before the phone is checked, before the external world is allowed to set the tone of the first hour, a period of genuine quiet in which you ask yourself honestly what kind of person you intend to be today, what values you intend to act from, what matters most today and what can be released as secondary. This is not affirmation. It is not positive thinking. It is the deliberate alignment of intention before the day begins, rather than the reactive management of intention after the day has already set its terms. The third is what the Stoics called the evening review. At the end of the day, in genuine quiet, an honest examination of where the day's behavior aligned with the day's intention and where it did not. Not as self-criticism, as information, as the honest data that makes genuine improvement possible rather than the comfortable story that makes the performance feel adequate. Marcus Aurelius did all three of these things consistently, not because he had extraordinary self-discipline, because he understood that the quality of the internal life determines the quality of everything produced from it, and the internal life does not maintain itself without deliberate attention. It requires the silence in which honest examination becomes possible. Lesson 9. What the quiet reveals. The specific insights that only silence produces. There are specific things that genuine silence reveals that the noise actively prevents from being seen. The first is the honest gap between values and behavior. Most people carry a set of stated values that diverge significantly from their actual behavioral patterns. They say they value depth, but spend most of their time on surface. They say they value genuine connection, but invest primarily in the performance of connection. They say they value meaningful work, but spend most of their energy managing how the work appears. In the noise, this gap is invisible because there is always enough activity to feel like the values are being lived. In the silence, the gap becomes impossible to miss, because the silence removes the activity that was functioning as a substitute for the genuine living of the values. The second thing silence reveals is what Jung called the inferior function. Every person has areas of genuine psychological weakness that they unconsciously compensate for rather than develop. The highly analytical person who avoids emotional intelligence. The highly relational person who avoids rigorous, independent thinking. The highly intuitive person who avoids the discipline of systematic development. These inferior functions do not stay neatly contained in the areas where they are weak. They leak into every area of life and create the specific recurring failures that are most difficult to understand, because they are operating from the least conscious part of the personality. In the silence, these functions become visible, because the silence removes the compensatory strategies that keep them hidden, and when they become visible, they become addressable. Seneca wrote, "It is the sign of a great mind to dislike greatness and to prefer things in measure to things in excess." The quiet reveals what you actually measure as great when the social measurement is removed, and building toward that genuine measurement rather than toward the external measurement produces the alignment and the motivation that sustained success requires. The third thing silence reveals is the difference between fear-based decisions and value-based ones. Most people, if they examine their decisions honestly in the quiet, discover that a significant proportion of what they do is driven by fear rather than by genuine intention. Fear of falling behind, fear of irrelevance, fear of being seen as insufficient. All of this masquerades as ambition and drive and the healthy pursuit of success. In the noise, it is indistinguishable from genuine motivation. In the silence, the difference becomes clear. And the person who can distinguish between what they are genuinely moving toward and what they are unconsciously fleeing from makes categorically different and categorically better decisions. Lesson 10. Go silent. Win big. The complete strategy and why it works. Everything in this conversation has been building toward this. The complete picture of why going silent is the hidden strategy of real success and how to use it deliberately. Here is the honest and complete summary of what the silence actually does and why it produces the results that the noise cannot. Silence gives the default mode network the activation it requires to produce the deepest and most sophisticated cognition available to the human brain. The self-understanding, the integration, the genuine creative insight that constant stimulation suppresses. Silence makes the shadow visible. The unexamined patterns that have been directing behavior from beneath the surface of awareness become accessible to conscious examination. And what is consciously examined loses its automatic power. Silence separates the persona from the genuine self. The adaptations from the authentic expression. The values that were inherited from the values that are genuinely held. And that separation is the foundation from which genuinely aligned and genuinely motivated action becomes possible. Silence reveals the gap between stated values and actual behavior, between the life being performed and the life actually being lived. And that gap, seen clearly, cannot be maintained. It demands either the honest acknowledgement that the performance is the priority or the genuine realignment of behavior toward the stated values. Both are more useful than the comfortable ambiguity that the noise maintains, and silence stops the premature crystallization of developing insights. It gives the genuine thinking room to develop fully before it is fixed by the social reception of sharing it too early. The Stoics and Jung are pointing at the same essential truth from different directions. Jung said the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Marcus Aurelius said you have power over your mind, not outside events. Epictetus said know first who you are and then adorn yourself accordingly. Seneca said retire into yourself as much as possible. All of them saying the same thing. The genuine life, the powerful life, the successful life in the deepest and most lasting sense is built from the inside, from the self that is found in the silence, not from the performance that is maintained in the noise. This is not a rejection of action. The Stoics were intensely practical people who believed deeply in engaged action in the world. Jung was not recommending withdrawal from life. He was recommending the internal work that makes the engagement with life genuine rather than performed. The silence is in service of the action. The inward journey is in service of the outward one. Go silent not to avoid the world, but to understand yourself clearly enough to engage with it genuinely. To build from a foundation that is actually solid. To move in a direction that is actually yours. To produce something that is actually real rather than the impression of something real. That is the hidden strategy, not louder, quieter, not more visible, more deeply understood, not more performing, more genuinely building. Go silent. Do the work that only silence makes possible. Examine what you have never examined. Find the genuine self beneath the performance. Build from that foundation and win in the only way that actually lasts. If you are ready to practice the complete strategy, claim this below. I go silent. I go deep. I win real. The world has never been louder, and the hidden strategy has never been more powerful precisely because of that. Because in a world where everyone is trying to be heard, the person who goes genuinely quiet stands out in the most important way possible. Not to other people, to themselves. 10 lessons from the intersection of Jungian psychology and Stoic philosophy. The noise is not the path. It is the obstacle disguised as the path. And the person who sees through it gains access to something the noise was permanently blocking. Individuation is the process nobody teaches and everybody needs. Becoming genuinely yourself, rather than an adapted version of yourself, is the foundation of everything real. The shadow is what you have never examined, and it is quietly running your life. Making it conscious removes its automatic power. Stoic withdrawal is the ancient practice of strategic silence, daily, deliberate, built into the structure of the life as a non-negotiable practice. Silence activates the default mode network, the most sophisticated cognitive systems available to the human brain, the ones suppressed by constant stimulation. Constant performance builds the impression rather than the substance, and the impression, sustained long enough, can become genuinely difficult to distinguish from the real thing, even to the person producing it. The persona is the mask, and finding the genuine self behind it is the most important and most undervalued work available. Strategic silence is practical and immediately available. The morning preparation, the evening review, the regular practice of active imagination, all of them accessible within an ordinary daily life. The quiet reveals the honest gap between values and behavior, between fear-based decisions and value-based ones, between the inherited self and the genuine one. And going silent deliberately and consistently is the complete hidden strategy, not the absence of effort, the redirection of effort toward the internal foundation that makes all external effort genuinely effective. Jung said the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. The silence is how that privilege is claimed. Go silent, win big. Not because silence is passive, because silence is where the real work happens. And the real work is the only work that produces anything genuinely worth having.